Good evening, this is John Milburn for PROP13001 Property Development. This is the Zoom session, live Zoom session for week 11, which deals with sustainable development. And in that regard, this week you need to read your textbook, of course, which is week 11 material, chapter 11. And you need to supplement that with not only the study guides, but also reference to key legislation and some websites. And in particular, I'd urge you to look at the Green Building Council of Australia website, and in particular, a case study. The case study is very interesting. It's the Commonwealth Bank Place case study, and that highlights some of the important property development aspects of sustainable development in the context of a large high-rise development completed in 2012. That development secured a 6-star rating on the Green Star rating scale. So what that tells me is that that's an important case study for a number of reasons. The first is that it provides you with a practical example of how sustainable development is important in the context of property development. The second is it provides you with some good insight as to how you might achieve a high rating in terms of sustainability rating tools for a property development. Thirdly, it identifies what are the guidelines by which the property developer must consider a property development, and how can that property developer make the property development more attractive, which will secure better approval, with regulators, and more attractive to an end consumer. So obviously, if you can increase the high rating of the sustainability, that will improve the desirability, if I can use that term, of the completed space. Now, when you're looking at these tools, when you're considering the content for this week, it may occur to you that we're really talking about large-scale developments, but that's not always the case. Even, for example, to take the property development example that we used as our assessment, a small development, 3 levels, commercial space, residential above. How does property development, how does sustainable development fit within the context of that type of property development? Well, in that regard, have a look at the sorts of things that will lead to a high level of desirability for sustainable development. And I think one of the good things that you can do is this. Have a look at the Green Building Council Australia website. Think about what the rating tool for sustainability seeks to achieve. Think about the general guidelines, and then always try to build that into your property development. Okay, so Green Building Council of Australia say, we develop buildings, cities and communities that are healthy, livable, productive, resilient and sustainable. So when you're a property developer, you want to think about those topics. And even if it's a marketing tool, I mean, I don't mean, don't take that the wrong way. I don't mean ignore the reality and only provide, the lip service. But even as a marketing tool, by developing something that you can genuinely say is healthy and livable, then that is likely to increase the price of the product that you've got available and increase the demand. Even if it doesn't increase the price, increasing the demand. So whatever it takes to achieve a high sustainability rating tool in terms of something that is healthy and livable is likely to make your project much more desirable, and you'll probably find that you'll more easily achieve finance, because financiers now are guided by these principles as well, and they have, particularly in the current climate, they're going to be under the scrutiny to ensure that what they do is prudential in terms of lending practice. So lending to property developers that can show that they are not only mindful of sustainable development, but willing to build in accordance with sustainable development principles is very important. Okay, so have a look at some of the other things that are in that website. For example, you need to build something that is productive, resilient and sustainable. And you need to build so that it is healthy, resilient and positive place for people to live and work in the context of the natural environment. Now, I know that might seem very theoretical and it might seem ethereal. How do we do that? But make it as practical as you can. So in this unit, I've been urging you to make what you read as practical as possible and use it. Now add to your toolkit. You know, I really was serious when I said that first assessment is really for you to take away with you. Don't leave it just as the assessment. Make it your own now and build in, if you don't have something on sustainable development, build that into it. And don't worry, you're not constrained by the 7 steps anymore. You can scrap that if you like, or as many as you like. But build in something about sustainable development and make sure that you have some way of identifying what is sustainable development, know the theory, know the law, know where it's sourced. Think about how government regulators use those principles in approving and considering applications. And then finally, think about how you can use these sustainable development principles in practice to not only build something which is a product of sustainable development, but something that you can market as being a product of sustainable development. All right, so now we've got Ellen online. Thank you, Ellen, for joining us. I'm just going to understand your microphone's not working, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat facility. Now, if you're watching this as a recorded session, I would urge you to immediately go to your toolkit, have a look at what you've already got in terms of sustainable development, and then add to that. So you're undertaking your reading and you're listening actively, and you are building material into your sustainable, regarding sustainable development into your toolkit. The other thing that I want you to do is be very proactive in terms of answering the review and tutorial questions. Now, the theory of it is this, that I post the questions online in Moodle, and the idea is that students proffer their opinion, add to the discussion. So we have the discussion through UCrew, which is, if you like, our default general discussion forum. But in Moodle, we have the specific discussion forums in relation to the weekly problems. Now, there's not a lot of traffic, I must admit, but we're only a very small group. Now, there's nothing wrong with helping each other in terms of collaboration. Not collusion, but collaboration. So if you have some thoughts in relation to any of the questions for this week tutorial, or indeed any of the weeks, I urge you to add something by way of a contribution. Others can see it, build on the discussion, add their own thoughts. And what it might mean is this. It might mean that you're actually helping each other with a view to passing the subject, passing the unit rather, and passing it well. So I like to think of this unit, this cohort, as supporting each other. I'll try and support you, and you can support me through the process as well. But supporting each other is really important now because we're only a few weeks away from the examination, and I want you to, at least as part of your preparation, have a good answer to every one of the weekly problems for the unit. Because when it comes to the exam, there is no bailout, there is no alternative question available to you in case you don't know one. So you really need to cover the entire spectrum of the unit. Sorry to do that to you, but the important thing is that you try and work collaboratively in sharing the load in that regard. I will talk more about the writing style for the examination shortly, but before I do, I just want to remind you of some of the important aspects of sustainable development from your reading this week. So of course, as I mentioned, read the textbook. Have a look at the quotation in the study guide drawn from the textbook at 11.8. And what impressed me about this quotation was, to be honest, something that I hadn't considered before I read it in the text. And that is that for a property developer in dealing with issues of sustainable development, it really is something that must be considered in two phases. The first is, in the broader phase, how we can assist globally, and within our community, I mean globally, externally, if you like, in terms of sustainable development. Then the second phase is, how can I make principles of sustainable development work to assist my bottom line? Now, I've already given a hint. If you produce a product which you can genuinely market as sustainable development, based on sustainable development principles, then you will either get a better price or greater demand, or maybe both. So that's going to help the bottom line in that regard. But if you look at the quote in 11.8, the authors look at it from the opposite perspective and say, well, maybe if you keep principles of sustainable development foremost in your mind, then it will give you an opportunity to save cost. So importantly, for a property developer, one of the things that you need to develop, have you noticed in this unit, there's so many things that you need to develop, and everything seems to be the first thing that you develop, the first thing you think about. Anyway, what you need to develop is a waste management strategy. Now, that's relevant at the design stage. It's relevant on site, and it's relevant in terms of how the property will be used in the future to ensure that whatever waste is produced is minimal. That can be a marketing tool as well as a cost saving. All right, so in terms of what we mean by sustainable development, obviously look at the definitions. You'll find that most of the definitions that relate to sustainable development incorporate this concept of ecologically sustainable development. And that all goes back historically to the 90s, the Rio conference on sustainable development in 92, and then again in 2012, which was called Rio Plus 20 or Plus 20, and legislation which flowed from some of the international materials that came about as a result of that conference. So the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, in particular, look at Section 3 and 3A. You probably don't need to go a whole lot more than that in terms of general principle. Have a look at the Planning Act, have a look at the long title to the Planning Act, and link this in with some of the planning discussions that we had a few weeks ago. Look at the planning regulations, and importantly, look at some of the policies. Now, I've given you a link to some of these in the study guide, but you need to be aware of them at least. And if you want to go beyond that, you'd actually go in, have a look at these, have a link to them, and determine how they might be, how you might use them as a property developer in practice. When I say use them, I mean in a positive and negative way. You need to consider issues of sustainable development in terms of promoting a positive property development, but also you need to consider it in a defensive manner as well. By that I mean that you have built in some way of repelling attacks upon you as a property developer, either through objectors who seek to oppose the development, or maybe even competitors or other interested parties. So you need to, if you like, use the principles of property development, sustainable development, as an answer to criticism, should that criticism be pointed to you. Now, I'm doing a lot of talking. Ellen says, I found in my research that having good environmental strategies were important in the area. So solar, that's a good point. Solar, use of rainwater, etc. Great point. Thank you, Ellen. So keep these things very practical. I haven't done it, but maybe even Google ways in which you can improve the sustainable development of your property project, and by actually putting in those things like solar, use of rainwater, etc. you're going to build in some practical mechanisms to do that. So in your reading this week, and to answer the questions this week, you'll have a mix of theory, background, the legislative basis upon which regulators can ask for these things, coupled with the very practical steps that you can take to ensure that you develop in a way that is sustainable. In terms of other materials, I've mentioned the international conventions, the definitions of ecological sustainable development. There are a couple of principles that are important. One is the precautionary principle. You'll hear this mentioned quite often. The precautionary principle is basically this, that if there is a threat of serious or irreversible environmental damage, then, and there is scientific uncertainty as to whether there exists a likelihood of damage or not, then the principle is triggered. And essentially it means that we don't have to wait to find out the results. If there's uncertainty, and that uncertainty is in relation to whether there is whether a threat of serious or irreversible damage will take place, then the precautionary principle is triggered and must be considered by regulators when considering applications. I mentioned the environmental protection policies. Now these come about from the Environmental Protection Regulation, which is part of the Environmental Protection Act, and there are regulations that you'll see that relate to air, noise, water. Have a link to those policies, identify what they mean, think about them in the context of your property development, how you can use them proactively and defensively as the case may be. Other than that, as I mentioned, I guess at the start, you need to consider case studies, think about sustainability rating tools, what these tools mean, where you can access them, what are used in Australia compared to overseas, and look at how you can improve the rating, sustainability rating of your property development by reference to the tools. I think this week's material, you can move fairly quickly through the theory. And I want you to do that. Move fairly quickly through the material, but I want you to then branch out into the real world, as it were, and you're thinking about things that Ellen did, for example, solar, use of water, rainwater. But what am I, rather than just say that in an assessment, where will I go? What are my techniques? Who will I use? It's all toolkit sort of stuff. Okay, no questions. Otherwise, I'll move on to a few comments about examination technique. And this follows on from the discussion that I started last week in terms of exam writing. Now, the first one is this. As a general rule, and I'm pretty strong on this, opt for shorter rather than longer sentences. So why would you do that? There's a couple of good reasons. The first is that when you're under pressure in an examination situation, there is a tendency for most people to ramble. In other words, the clarity of thought disappears and anxiety takes over, and we tend to spill things out. And we get on a roll, you know, we think about a phrase and then, oh, we'll think about something else, we think of something. And suddenly your sentence is a paragraph. It's about four lines long, and it's very hard to read. Now, if you use short sentences, particularly if you write in the active voice, you are likely to produce a document that is highly readable and also focused. Short, sharp sentences, to the point. Emphasize what you need to emphasize. Avoid excess verbiage. You'll make your point easier that way. Also write in the active voice. The accused hit the victim as opposed to the victim was hit by the accused. Now, I probably mentioned all of these things last week, but they are important. So your primary aim is to inform the reader. I'll be the reader of your examination questions. You know the style that I like, so you'll probably want to take up on that hint. But write with authority. If you're, not that you've got a problem question as such in this essay, it's not like the assessment. They're more essay questions, but do write with authority. Write as if you are the educator. And you can be innovative, even in an exam. If you see the need to use flowcharts or lists, perhaps you can do that. Anything that you think conveys the message best, you can do that in handwriting as well. Don't slavishly copy and paste too much, but if you do, you won't have a computer, but I mean in terms of copying directly from a textbook, for example. But if you do source material elsewhere, please ensure that you reference it. Now, you don't have to use footnote referencing for the exam, but I do expect that you will acknowledge the original source in some way or another. When you're referring to legislation, make sure that you include the name of the Act, the year of the Act, and include a note whether it's from Queensland, QLD, or the Commonwealth, CTH. That way I know that you've sourced the correct legislation. If you're referring to a case, you can put in the case reference, or if you're really stuck for time, just put in the year of the case. All right, so other than that, I would refer you to my video about, what did I call it? Level 3 examination or short window online paper preparation. You'll see it on the front page of Moodle. That'll give you an idea of what I think you should do from a practical perspective in preparing for the examination. Now, Eleanor said, in terms of referring to the material that you source from elsewhere, how do you do it? Well, if you're familiar with the Harvard method of referencing, you can use that. But essentially it would be this. So that if you draw 3 lines or 4 lines from your textbook, then I'm happy for you to put in brackets Reed and Sims at 11.8, close brackets. I'll know what you mean by Reed and Sims, so you don't have to give the full citation. Don't spend time putting in, the publisher's name, etc. If the publication that you refer to is a little more obscure, you may have to give me a little bit more information about it. But if you said your textbook or you said Reed and Sims, give me the paragraph number, and I would probably put that in brackets immediately following the material that you have sourced elsewhere. So I hope that answers the question, Ellen. All right, so good luck with your preparation. So what do we take from tonight's session? The first is, with your reading, read through the material fairly quickly. Don't get too hung up on the theory, and as quickly as you can, get to the practical aspects. Number 2, share information with each other in a productive, collaborative sense. I encourage that. Number 3, write answers to the tutorial questions, and remember that you can take your answers into the examination. And I don't mind if you just copy them. So it's not cheating. If you've written an answer, you take it into the exam and you think, wow, that's lucky. That's exactly the exam question that I'd prepared for. I have my answer written and I'll just write it out. I'm perfectly happy with that. So with the examination, it's a full open book examination, other than you can't have something to access the internet. But you can take in your textbook, you can take in your notes, you can take in other external reference material as you see fit. All right. If there are any questions, please ask through uCrew. If not, send me an email. If you have any answers to tutorial questions, please consider uploading what you believe is an appropriate answer into the Moodle site. So I think you all know what I mean. Just go to the bottom of the material for the week. You'll see the problems, and there might be 6 or 8 or 9, whatever there is. Click on that, and you can add your submission, and others may follow you. All right, that'll do us for tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellen, for joining us live for the live session, and we'll see you next week for week 12, our final session. All the best. Bye.